Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. Now, we're all born with a particular genetic makeup that's shaped by our environment and our life experiences, but we're not born with a manual for how to use that personality in our work, how we make sense of the world, how we create relationships, or how we change things about ourselves as well. So to help us with that, we've actually invited Nikita Mikhailov. And Nikita is passionate about studying human beings. He's a psychometrician. He's just launched his brand new book, Personality, A User's Guide. And this reflects a decade dedicated to the field of psychometrics. In his career, he's worked with Fortune 500 companies, finance, banking, transport, construction, aerospace, to name a few.
That was a good introduction. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
I'm not even halfway yet. we have more positive things to say.
Start with the narcissism, why don't you?
On top of that, he's also a lecturer for Hult Business School. He's developed assessments. He uses them with individuals, couples, which we're absolutely intrigued about, teams, and also helped people qualify to use them as well. As we mentioned, he's just launched his new book as of February 15th, which he's co-written with Georgi Yankov. Yes, we spent the whole weekend devouring this book at speed.
I've got little tabs all through it.
Oh, that's the shows of your personality, Danny.
Absolutely.
Yes. And I just have folded over pages. So again, that probably says a lot about me. And already it's a #1 bestseller on Amazon. It's a user guide. So it really combines a nice blend of theory and input, but real practicality as well. And it sort of really lays the foundation about how personality works, the definitions and the elements of what it takes to actually help influence your personality and develop it too as well, and actually sort of busts a few myths along the way. So we're absolutely delighted to have Nikita join us. One of the really nice quotes that Nikita said in one of his webinars is, we're all special, we're all messy, and we're all unique, and we all share some commonalities as well. And I think that's a really nice place to start, because we really want to understand, what is personality and why does it matter? So welcome, Nikita.
Well, thank you so much for such an introduction. And at least it's nice to see 3 books have been sold. 1 to me and 2 to you, which is great. So, to answer your questions, what is personality and why does it matter? Well, the first one, we don't know. And the second one, it depends. Because at the end of the day, we don't know what personality is. That's what makes it very interesting. I mean, in the book, we give 5 different definitions of personality according to the American Psychological Association, APA, which represents over 100,000 psychologists, 150,000 last time I checked, to different professors, to different speakers, all of this. And we can't define it, it seems, which is fascinating in itself, because it doesn't stop us from using it every day. Such as, how often do you hear people mention the word personality, such as next time you take your earpods out and listen to, not that you do, but, just in passing, somebody says, oh, my boss's personality, or my cat's personality, or, I bought this chair because of personality. It had real character. Because often it's interchangeable. So we still use the psychological construct of personality in everyday language without actually having a defined definition for it. And I guess this answers the second question, why it matters, because people use it. There's something we find inherently useful in it. And to me, it goes back to the first personality assessment, which is the zodiac. It's the star signs. You get asked one question. Well, actually, there might have been before the zodiac, there might be other personality assessments. It's just kind of lost track through time. But you're asked one question, when were you born? And you get 12 types. Popular type models only have 16, so only 4 more than 12. Took us like 1,000 years to come up with that. And each character, each star sign has its own characteristics, like Leo's. I'm a Leo, so it's clearly the best. So kind of more extroverted, dominant, all of this. And, and then the other thing is, how do they match with other characters like Virgos? And there's this whole libraries on this, how different stuff. Well, I guess there's libraries, but probably several books, but probably typical of a Leo to do hyperbole. But the key thing is there's probably several books on how different star signs interject. There's also different books on type, how different types get together, or the big 5, how different traits get together. And to me, when we look back at the history of psychometrics and how it evolved over literally millennia, people like to look at the star, like to look for patterns. But basically, people love to look for patterns to explain individual differences. So before we looked for patterns in the stars, now we look for patterns in your Twitter feed and what words you use through the natural language processing or data scraping. Okay, so people like to look at patterns. They like to identify individual differences. They like to use it to self-reflect, my star sign, but they also like to see, oh, well, this is how I get on, because I don't get on with John because he's a Virgo, and stuff like that, or because he's an INTJ, or because he's extroverted or neurotic, or you name it. The key thing is the language is different, the frame, but the need for it seems to be universal.
Cool. You mentioned there the big five, and that's a kind of a thread throughout your book. You talk about the big five. Can you just explain to the audience, the kind of people listening, a bit more about the big five and what that is?
Okay.
Because we have quite a broad audience, so some people will be quite accomplished in psychometrics, and some people will be taking their first steps into it as well. So definition is always really useful, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I would take any excuse to talk about Big Five, especially with a cup of tea. And this is a very rare time because I've been asked to talk about it rather than just talking about it without being asked.
The floor is yours, Nikita.
Anyways, but moving on now to the Big Five. So basically, there were two dudes, Allport and Odbert, in 1930s, who very interested what the French were doing with intelligence testing, which later has become IQ assessments. And so we're like, okay, we want to create a personality assessment, but where should we start? So they decided to go down the route which is called psycholexical, psychology of language. Because the idea was, if there's some difference between you and I, by now, throughout human history, we should have came up with a word for it. And they picked up an English dictionary in 1930s and identified every word they had to think was character, personality, individual differences. Any guesses how many they picked?
No.
Mm-hmm.
Can't remember. I'm sure it was in the book, and I can't remember.
I thought you were going to test this on the book here. 12?
Close. 17,908.
Okay.
So after this, what has started is factor analysis. So to look which words came together. So for example, if you're angry, are you also frustrated, likely to be frustrated? If you're sad, are you also likely to be depressed? If you're anxious, are you more likely to be worried? If you're exuberant, are you more likely to be, whatever exuberant people are. Let me just switch off Outlook. So it's just to give an understanding what kind of things go together. And there's a huge amount of debate at which point it kind of came up, but basically through data analysis and all of that good stuff, by 1980s, we have arrived that those 17,908 words gravitate around 5 factors. So like there's 5 points of gravity. So one of them is neuroticism. So what comes to your mind when you hear the word neuroticism?
Like a nervous disposition, anxious.
Oh, nervous disposition, anxious. Yep. So basically close. So neuroticism has to do with negative emotional affect. So we have neuroticism. But if you score high on neuroticism, you're more likely to experience that affect more often. So more day-to-day kind of depression, anxiety, vulnerability, self-consciousness, all that stuff. No two neurotics are the same. They experience different negative emotional affects for different reasons, but they're just more likely to experience more often. You're also more likely to worry about things that can go wrong. Now, if you're low on neuroticism, it doesn't mean you're not neurotic, but as a colleague of mine, Gordon Curfey, says, your level of your neuroticism is the length of your fuse. So you can put up with more negative stimuli until you have a negative emotional reaction to it. Now, if you ask, do people want to change their personality? 80% in America, in that particular sample, said that they want to be less neurotic. So people don't want to be neurotic. I have rarely had clients who want to be more neurotic. Neuroticism has a very strong cultural bias. So in some countries, it's more okay to be neurotic than in others. Also, people want to be low neuroticism, but the issue, if you're low neurotic, if stuff does happen in your life, which causes you emotional negative affect, you don't have the coping mechanisms, you don't recognize negative emotions. Because if a high neurotic feels negative emotions, it's like Simon and Garfunkel, hello, darkness, my old friend. Somebody low on neuroticism experience negative emotions, like, what the hell is this? And therefore, there's also potentially another aspect to this, that when something happens in your social group to a friend that's low in neuroticism, your other friends say, don't worry, they'll be fine. But actually, because they see them as more resilient day to day. But actually, this is why we need to check in on your low and high neurotics. And, we need to salute also high neuroticism, because as Bob Hogan says, our more contempt ancestors got eaten. There's benefits to high neuroticism, like what the worst things that can happen are famous last words for a reason. But as this wonderful quote on Facebook, so I know it's true, that society needs a pessimist and an optimist. The optimist builds the airplane, the pessimist the parachute. And I think we so much focus on no, glass half full. No, it's like the whole glass full, half empty. It's both half full and half empty at the same time. It's not an either or, it's an and. And therefore, we need to kind of make sure that we value both ends of this. And this is why my job title is Chief Neuroticism Officer, because I see so many Chief Happiness Officers running about LinkedIn.
You're trying to balance them out.
Well, exactly. Somebody needs to fly the flag for negative emotional affect. Every film starts off with this, every disaster movie starts off with a scientist being disregarded. That's saying, oh my God, something's awful is going to happen. And halfway through the movie, they realize, oh crap, the scientist might have been right. And I feel that so many in corporates, when I see like a big mess up, be it from within really dodgy advertising to doing really unethical stuff. And when they get caught, and I go, I wonder when they actually were meeting about this ad, was there somebody high on your neuroticism going, don't you think people might see it this way? It's like, quiet down, John. Stop being so negative. I just wonder if I could just see that meeting when the event, whatever happened, was green lighted. Was a neurotic voice being toned down in the voice in the room, like, stop being so negative.
Yeah, because in the book you talk about the importance of yin and yang, don't you? Darkness and light, and those it's the organization's ability to tolerate that diversity, which is critical to its success.
Well, it's how you facilitate. It's not even yin and yang, it's how they move together. And there we come to extroversion, which is positive emotional affect. So people high on extroversion tend to experience positive affect more. So they tend to be more positive and outgoing, potentially. And they need this energize of being sociable to get energy from interacting with lots of people. But same as neuroticism has a social bias, so does extroversion, introversion, because we always put the extroversion on the pedestal. Because remember that sample of 80%? Of them wanted to be less neurotic and they wanted to be more extroverted. So it's a very socially desirable trait. A lot of, extroverted items are like, I'm fun to be around. Well, people probably going to say yes to that. Who people would say, I'm miserable to be around. So what's important here is that, again, there's a social bias towards one, especially in our culture, rather than the other. So for me, often people say introverts are asocial or antisocial. And I go, well, actually being antisocial is psychopathy, which is a bit different. And there's loners, they're unemotional, they don't care. And it's like, no, I always say introverts are just extroverts with good taste. They're just more selective what and who they want to socialize with. So, and extroverts often see introverts as rejecting of them because you're presenting and you're so excited about what you're presenting about, and you want other people to feel excited too, to validate like outwardly, and there's poker faced and cross their arms, and you go, they don't like my presentation, and then you think, oh, where's this video on YouTube about body language, and it said that if they're cross-armed, they don't like you. So all of a sudden it escalated, and both of those things might be true, but what also might be true is that you're just more introvert and they're just listening to you, and they didn't do anything to show this to you. That you treat this lack of display as a presence of something else, but they might be just listening. Same as introverts often don't speak up in meeting because the extroverts never shut up.
Yeah, I really like that tip in your book about, if you're an extrovert and you ask any questions, just take that 15-second gap and create the space for people your introverts to have a think and go, yeah, actually, I've got a question. I really like that. Yeah,
exactly. It's so simple because that's the key thing. As an extrovert, it's so hard to shut up. So whenever I see this LinkedIn post, 5 things it takes no effort it's like to listen. I'm just like, not if you're a bloody extrovert. You're just, just like you're eager to say something. So the moment that the speaker pauses and go, you go, right. I've just been waiting 5 minutes. I didn't listen for the last 5 minutes. I just had my question. So when extroverts present, they think it will be the same, that there's somebody who's just going to jump immediately like them at that question. But another kind of thing you can do, especially if you're facilitating a discussion, I always ask people to talk to the person next to them, such as, what were your takeaways? Or what's your questions about the presentation? Or, what would you like to know more? Talk to the person next to you and then ask for group participation. So they already have run it through with somebody one-to-one, and then they're more likely to participate.
And an interesting thing, again, you sort of talk about in the book is obviously you have the big 5, but they don't stand in isolation. So you've got like extroversion and agreeableness. One of the things you talk about, the fact is, if you have a leader and it's like a unique blend of those ingredients make them the person. You talk about like a leader who is emotionally stable, high in openness, and extroverted would be described as charismatic. But charismatic doesn't equal effective. So there's something around how those 5 unique blends come together to create you, aren't they?
Oh, I'm so happy you mentioned that because it's how they interact. So I had a client, high extroversion openness, and no, high extroversion, low neuroticism, so a happy chappy. And I asked him, because to me what's most interesting, especially in leadership, is not your personality, it's how you relate to your opposite. And we'll get on to why is that important. But I asked him, how do you relate to more emotionally dynamic colleagues? And he immediately said, oh, when they come to me with their emotions. It's also always watch out when people use the word "their" before describing other people's emotional states. Don't score that high on empathy usually. And they go, when they come to me with their emotions, they tell them two things. And I go, which are? He goes, one, nobody died. Two, they should grow up. And I go, what if this doesn't work? He goes, I just send them to HR. As my friend Paul Harris says, it's very hard to define emotional intelligence, what it is, but it's very clear when people don't have it. So, and then we, of course, we have openness, which is about creativity, thinking the world differently, agreeableness, how well you relate to others, and conscientiousness, strengths of drive and purpose. So neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness.
And again, one of the things of the book that we really enjoyed is because it's very easy to be very sort of reflective when it comes to personality, but it is in relation to others, and that's the critical part, isn't it? And that does shape our personality and how it develops.
Completely, because our personality doesn't exist in a vacuum. We're connected to everything. Your personality, it's a two-way street. It's the same as, nurture versus nature. That there was this whole debate, but it becomes much more interesting when you replace the verses with and. So it's nature and nurture. It's about your environment and your personalities that combines into behavior. But your personality influences what environments you seek out, and the environments you're in influence your personality. And it's a two-way street, and this is one of the reasons I think we can't define personality, because it's so fluid. We can see sort of layers of personality, stuff you like, stuff you do too much. That shows up nicely, with the Hogan suite. So the values, then bright side, then dark side. Then you have other assessments which tap into it, like Luminous Spark, with their underlying everyday overextended. So you have this theme emerging in personality assessments. Well, Hogan has been doing it since the mid-80s, is that there's layers to it. So we can't quite define what exactly it is, and we can't pin it down, but there seems to be layers to it. So between your preference, your behavior, your maladaptive response.
Yeah. So one of the things you talk about, so you said just then that lots of people who are high in neuroticism want to change that, and people want to be more extroverted. So you talk about kind of changing personality in the book, that it's possible to do. It's not fixed. It is possible to change personality. It's just hard. So
well, first of all, do you really need to change it? So first of all, to what extent is cultural biases? Like the 80% is just general population. We don't know if they're neurotic or not. They just wanted to be less neurotic. To me, that's it's also one of the best catches in personality. For example, neuroticism. Neuroticism basically exists on three pillars. Well, one is negative emotional negative self-construct. So all what we explore when we talk about personality is a self-construct, the self-narrative, the story you tell yourself. Because when you work with a psychometric, you're not working with a report. You're working with the person and their narrative and the way it shows up when they're asked 200 questions about themselves, how it shows up. But what we're testing is the narrative. That's what we're assessing. And that's what manifests itself in the report. So to me, whenever I'm using the psychometric, I would always ask a client, how would you describe yourself? That's the first step. And then we kind of build how they see themselves. And the thing with neuroticism, people have a negative attitude towards their self-construct. So they're not happy with who they are. So this is why, for example, because of confirmation bias, if you tell somebody, give feedback to a high neurotic, they'll probably remember the negative words first. They might kind of quickly skim over. They might not even read the positives. They just go to the areas of development, just like that. And even if they read them, maybe in the days they'll remember all the negative points. They'll probably add a few. They'll forget half of the positives, and in the weeks they go, what positives? I have so much to work on, because it's more aligned with their negative attitude towards the self-construct. So when we work with a high neurotic colleague, make sure that you meet them at the time where they have energy so not Friday, 6 p.m. when they've been running on coffee all the time. Maybe, have a nice kind of sit down in the morning or afternoon, nice chill out, and ask them to play back what they feel that went well, all of this. When you give them positive feedback, ask to play it back in their own words. So you do everything to make sure that it landed. But if you want to kind of ask them what they can do better, or stuff like that, they'll probably give you a bigger list than the development points you have in your review. But the issue is that if you want to work on neuroticism, first you need to address the negative self-construct. Because if you say, I'm neurotic, I don't like this about myself, I need to change, the first thing you're doing, you're feeding your neuroticism. You're feeding that negative construct about yourself. But actually, how about first saying, okay, when has neuroticism worked well for me? Because high neurotics, if you ask them about the past, they go, especially if they're high on conscientiousness and openness, does your mind come up with options of, when stuff happens and, you come back and it's like, oh, if I've done something differently, it would have been better. So, well, I go, does your mind ever come up with an option if you've done something different, it could have been worse? And they go, oh, no, I never think of that. I was like, doesn't that sound slightly biased? So let's explore when that neuroticism kept you out of trouble. Oh, and where was the benefit of this? Or when your neuroticism really spikes, maybe like Friday evening, because you're so tired. And, and how can we work with this? And there's this danger of pathologizing this, like imposter syndrome. It's not a syndrome. It's okay to have moments of self-doubt. Like, who doesn't, who has less self-doubt? Psychopath. So if you have strong imposter syndrome, look at the bright side. At least it's unlikely you're antisocial psychopath. And I recently asked a forensic psychotherapist that actually. I was like, is it actually true? And she go, yeah, you're less likely to have an inner critic, an imposter syndrome, or stuff like that. Therefore, we need to look at the bright side of neuroticism. We need to potentially look at the humorous side. And actually, talking about humor, they've actually done a research where it shows there's a correlation between good performance and stellar performance, between people who score average on neuroticism have good performance, but people who score over the scale on neuroticism have stellar performance. And that is stand-up comedy.
Interesting.
So I think humor plays a fantastic part in disarming our neuroticism. Instead of thinking, okay, it's my imposter syndrome. Does it stop you from doing stuff you want to do? No. Well, maybe it's okay to have a moment of that. Maybe you're not as reckless. Let's think about it. Or, it's, it's the inner critic. Yeah, it tries to keep you out of trouble, try to keep you over committing to stuff, potentially. So let's look at the bright side of this. The things that was humor when you can disarm it. But if you just want to be less neurotic because you don't like yourselves, that actually reinforces your neuroticism.
Different sort of scores and different traits are there, or what's the relationship between pressure and stress?
Well, I'll give you the typical answer. It depends. So first, how can you tell that there's a couple of tell signs if an article on well-being and stress is written by a person who knows psychology and a person who doesn't? So first thing is the takeaway. The article starts with the words, all psychologists agree, or psychologists agree, ... Psychologists never agree on anything. And there's probably psychologists who never agree that psychologists never agree. Fair enough. If you're listening to that, I feel you and hear you. But the key thing here is that second one thing is that when they describe well-being, a psychologist would always put down subjective well-being, because what's well-being and stress for me is very different to what's stress for you, etc. But stress is this wonderful word that people think is completely universal. And when you work with teams, it's really interesting to explore how stressed are they now? If they write down a little number on a piece of paper and then we hold them up. And some people will be 10% stressed and some people 90%. And they're working in the same team.
Yeah, because the reason we're sort of asking the question, like with Myers-Briggs, there was some work done by Naomi Quenk and about being in the grip, for example. And so there's certain patterns of things, but there's different triggers for every person. It's about people sort of taking responsibility for their own mental health and obviously the influence of the environment as well. But what tips do you have for people to sort of maintain balance? And often when we're having a full stressful moment, it's almost too late. So how can you apply your awareness to really support you to make sure you prevent rather than have to cure stress or pressure?
First of all, stress, pressure, and our reaction to it served us well to this point. Because there was some circumstances when reacting to this kind of triggers in this particular way was beneficial. But that's first thing. So we need to acknowledge that it has worked for us. That's why they're there. It's just the circumstances might have changed. So what worked for you before might not what works for you now in this particular company. It can even change between companies, let's say. What's acceptable in one is not what's acceptable in the other. But what's really important here is that first acknowledge that it's there for a reason. It's not a byproduct. It's not some toxicity in you, etc. It has worked for you. So first of all, it's great. Second, just know when you're more likely to be stressed and by what. So for example, if you're more likely to be stressed by attention to detail, and when you get a brief, just go through it and you go, okay, what's going to stress me out the most here? What's going to take me most energy? What's going to stress me out? And most people will potentially procrastinate and leave it to the last moment, which is most likely to stress them out. And though some people might use that stress to actually kick them into gear and get stuff done. But the key thing is that when you get a project, and this is where it comes to working with others, just think, okay, which parts I find most difficult to stress me out, and look around my team who I can delegate this to. So if attention to detail stresses you out, you going over your PowerPoint at 2 a.m. before the presentation might not be the best, but buying a coffee at 2 p.m. to your colleague and going through the slides together, and they can spot mistakes without even reading them, which I think is borderline magic. When people just look at a piece of text and go, here, 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 and here, I'm just like, you haven't read it, just stands out for me. And just like, bloody hell. So, you can work with them, or, you're going to be particularly stressed by interacting with a particular stakeholder. Okay, who interacts with the stakeholder well in your team? Okay, how about have a chat with them and say, I have a meeting coming up. What's your tips? It's immediately thinking, okay, it's not all on me, but how I can facilitate collective intelligence around me in order to get stuff done in the least stressful way possible. And then, of course, things like self-care, what gives you energy to make sure it's intertwined in your diary and all of that stuff. But yeah, I would suggest first, your stress response there for a reason. Might not work that well in your current settings, but might work well in the previous ones. And just kind of working with that proactively, but also appreciating that is there rather than something that you need to get rid of.
So, Nikita, are you saying that I can make a list of tasks to delegate to Danny?
Yeah, you can.
Just while we're recording.
Likewise.
But it's like what Esther Perel says, and I love her stuff on relationships. The psychotherapist just says, in couples, just every week write down 3 things you want the other partner to do more towards you, and they write down 3 things they would like you to do more towards them, and stick it on your bathroom cabinet.
Great. I'm glad we touched on that, because the couples counselling is a really interesting area. But Danny, I'll let you press on with your question.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about personality in the workplace. So are there particular aspects of personality you think are underappreciated in the workplace, or aspects that are overplayed or given more priority than they should?
Well, it depends again in what places, like, in what histories and what environments and what cultures.
I was just thinking generally in the organizations you're working in, do you often see that certain, I guess maybe in leadership particularly, as people, we look at a lot of the leaders kind of that we see, they tend to be extroverted, they tend to kind of demonstrate that stuff. So what's the role of, for example, introverts as leaders? We don't see as many role models for that in the workplace.
It's a good question. So as far as introversion and extroversion, there's a good book by Susan Cain called Quiet, Confessions of a Passion. No, that's Quiet. The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. There's also a good TEDx talk by a guy called Brian Little called Confessions of a Passionate Introvert. And they they describe this quite well. But what we know from research is that extroversion is correlated with desire for power. Extroverts want it more. But as Garen, right? You previously mentioned that just because they want it charismatically and they're charismatic doesn't mean they're effective. And the same with extroverts. There's no correlation with effectiveness as a leader. But because they want it more, they're more statistically likely to end up in positions of power, which I think then fuels our stereotypes of extroverted leaders, which then kind of comes back to the cycle that we see extroverts more as leaders, they're more likely to become leaders. And with introverts, they're less likely to draw attention to themselves necessarily and less likely to actually want positions of power. So compared to extroverts, generally speaking. So the issue becomes then that you have more extroverts will form our stereotypes based on that, and you have less introverts. But introverts can bring a lot to positions of power. Like most of my high leadership in organizations I work with often don't listen. So they describe themselves as highly empathetic, but I go, well, if you don't listen, what are you empathizing to? Or, you often get like, oh, Nikita, can you come in and do a workshop for us? Because they're also introverted and they never speak up, my team. And then you attend their meetings and you go, yeah, maybe that's one of the reasons. But did you notice you never shut up the whole meeting? So when was I supposed to speak up? And yeah.
I'm really enjoying the positioning that you're talking about there. Is it the role of the occupational psychologist to go in and to question assumptions and to help people make sense of, like, if you're doing psychometrics, to help people really sort of operationalize their insights? Like, what is the role of an occupational psychologist?
Well, depends on the settings. Occupational psychologists work across a whole plethora of settings, from human factors, ergonomics, well-being, design, all this. My area of specialty is psychometrics. I'm a psychometrician. So for me, what's really important here is that if at the beginning of the workshop, I just say, or any program we're doing, I will say, look, if by the end of this, we can be a couple of percent more curious about ourselves and others, and a couple of percent less judgmental about ourselves and others, it will be a success. Because, like, for example, this comes to the point of, let's say everybody currently likes to bash MBTI, but MBTI sells more than pretty much all the psychometrics combined. And I think that a lot of criticism for MBTI is actually might be a little bit of sexism. maybe because it's the only psychometric one of the few psychometrics created by women, mother and daughter, and is still more successful than anything else. Like by far, most psychometrics are designed by balding men, so I think I'm just about ready to make my own assessment. But yeah, also middle age, so more reasons to create a psychometric, clearly. But the key thing is that MBTI is, though people criticize it and all of this, but it's still useful for what it is. Let's say, for example, if you score high on extroversion, if you do your assessment half an hour, if you do a coaching session an hour, and if you do a team workshop a day. So, 1.5 days investment, like max, let's be honest. And then if you're a high extrovert, you realize that just because people are introverted doesn't mean they reject you. And if you're a high introvert, you realize that unless you tell an extrovert what you want, they won't ask you necessarily or listen to you because they're not psychic. So you need to communicate. Is there just like one thing you take away for the rest of your life from a 1 hour, 1 day engagement, more or less? That's a huge return on investment because that will make your life easier going forwards. So from my perspective, my role is to get people a bit more curious about themselves and others, starting to question their self-narrative. Because, we update software on our phones and laptops and, printers. Just saw printer in the corner. Couldn't think of any other devices. Anyway, well, probably smart fridges as well, regularly. But how often do we update who we think we are? That narrative doesn't get updated very often. And even when people tell you, like my partner might go, Nick, you're being argumentative. And I go, no, I'm not. Because we disagree with stuff that doesn't confirm to our bias. So it's kind of locked in. And it becomes even more interesting than when you ask people why they manage their personality. So I might be working with a senior executive in their 40s and 50s. And I say, what do you manage about your personality and work? And why? And say, well, I need to be less emotional at work. Yeah? Why? And they go, because my first manager told me I should not be so emotional at work. When was that? Oh, when I was 20, working in the neighborhood shop. And I go, and now you're managing director of a multinational. Things have changed, but people have been managing their personality based on that little bit of feedback. So how often you update this. So for example, even just questioning somebody, okay, next time somebody comes to you with a piece of feedback, instead of saying, no, I'm not this, ask them when was the last time they seen you do this? Or can you tell me a couple of times when they interpret your behaviors this way? Because this was where it becomes fun. If you're in a room of 12 people, there's 12 versions of you. There's how you see yourself and how 11 people see you. And each sees you differently because they differently interpret your behaviors. They see you at different points in time. So there's 12 versions of you and you only know one. So wouldn't it be fun to go around and next time, instead of say, sorry, I disagree, this is not me, you go, when was the last time I see you shown this? Like, when did you interpret this? This is fascinating. And then if another key thing is that when people immediately want to change their personality, like that 80%. So people say, how can I be this? How can I be that? But the beauty is that we often work with people who are very different to us. And your life can be so much easier. And if you don't obsess about how you can be more of this or that, doesn't matter what, like more vulnerable. Well, is that really a good thing? Because to me, like when people say you need to be more vulnerable, it implies there's a threat you're vulnerable to. So maybe we should address the threat first before encouraging people to be vulnerable. Just saying. Or, when people say need to be more empathetic, like really? Maybe they're already really empathetic, or they should be more trusting. Well, what if they're already trusting? Because like BoJack Horseman, it's very funny when you look at people with rose-tinted glasses, all the red flags appear like ordinary flags. Maybe they should be more trusting. Or maybe when people should be tougher. Well, maybe already some people see them as, so maybe they shouldn't be more tough. All of this kind of advice on personality is what you should do more as a leader. It's just what's in vogue right now. And it usually goes for about 2 years, and then it kind of comes back again. Growth mindset is a good example. Hot 5 years ago, and it was hot again. There's no more evidence to support it. There's actually pretty much almost no evidence to show it has any connection with anything of importance. And there's meta studies which shown this, but it still comes back because people find it useful. It's, to me, growth mindset, fixed mindset is again yin and yang, same stuff, different package. Or as in personality, we have plasticity, stability. It's just with yin and yang, there's appreciation of both. With growth and fixed mindset, it's one-sided. And, growth mindset is correlated, well, it's mappable to what's called plasticity of personality. It's extroversion and openness. What, we want to give more ammunition for extroverts to talk about themselves? Really? Like, oh, you should just get the growth mindset. No, this is a risk analysis. We need one. Oh, you're being so fixed mindset right now. Let's see how far that gets you. So And to me, what's really important is that we value both. And same as in teams and organizations, we value both sides of the coin. So whether we talk about growth and fixed mindsets, I was like, okay, you can have growth, which is about innovation. But what we talk about fixed, I often call it nurturing. You nurture ideas and relationships. So I call it implementation, and you also get stuff done. And you need innovation and implementation to have manifestation. And it's a cycle. Implementation drives innovation, innovation drives implementation. So we're back to yin and yang. So it's a dynamic between the two that counts. And for that dynamic to work, you need to respect both sides. So if your culture on, like one of my favorite things is for people to write down or stand in the quality, if I'm using the map, stand in the quality which you feel this organization encourages you the most to be. And then stand in the quality of the ones you appreciate and others the most. So sometimes organizations, we need to be this, this, and this. It's really fun. Like when you work with this, what you like, what you do too much, you so often find people who like to be creative, but don't get a chance to be every day because they work in logistics. And the management's decision, oh, they're so not creative. We just need to get a creative person in there. But is it really going to work, or is it just going to become like them or quit? And maybe we can change some of the cultures and the job descriptions of the team to give that more creativity a space.
And we did actually have a question from a viewer who actually wanted to ask a specific question about that, didn't we, Danny?
We did, yes, Sarah, because we posted on LinkedIn that we're going to be talking to you, and she came up with a couple of questions, and one of them was about which personality traits are most strongly associated with the kind of growth mindset. So
well, it's very hard to measure constructs like growth mindset, fixed mindsets, because it depends. But to me, when we look at this research, we know there's plasticity of personality, which is extroversion and openness, and stability. It's called the meta factors, or alpha and beta. And stability is low neuroticism, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. So, and both sides, and most of us are a mix of both. As Garen previously mentioned, none of us exist in isolation, but some people with very strong extroversion and openness will be always talking about their ideas, and they're always going to be very excitable by them because it has to do potentially with the dopaminergic system. So people who score on this trait, when they get a promise of a reward. So if you put people into an fMRI tube to look at the activity of your brain, and people who score high on plasticity, high on stability, plasticity people, when they go, you're going to get a reward, and they get a reward. So they have activation. Both groups have activation in the brain areas we associate with reward. But what's really fun is the people high on plasticity will get activation at the promise of the reward. And potentially it has to do with dopaminergic activation as well. And dopamine doesn't make you feel good. Dopamine makes you feel on edge. So this kind of jumping up and down, and often introverts will see extroverts as Labradors. They're just so excitable. They're just, oh, that's gonna, this request for proposal coming in, I'm gonna win that, and then it's gonna lead to more work, and then I'm gonna take over the world. It escalates quickly, as in Anchorman it was said. But the key thing is that you're more people high on stability go, we haven't even submitted the proposal, we haven't even won it. Why are you so excited? We haven't delivered it yet. And so there's this misconception. And so to me, growth mindset in practical work, I think, is associated highly with plasticity. But what's associated with what people call fixed mindset is stability. It's about relationships. It's about getting stuff done. It's about delivery, and it's about also doing stuff in a predictable way. And I think what's really important here is that, we say that, okay, growth has a good part, which is all about creativity, ideas, going into ambiguity, coming up with ideas in ambiguous situations, but so does stability, which is about delivery and relationships. And and both can be overplayed. If you have growth, which is uncontrolled, you have chaos. If stability is not innovated, you have fixed. But same as you can overplay yin and yang when we look at that framework. So, though I have no idea what I'm talking about beyond the Wikipedia entry at this point.
No.
That's good.
So I think it's about it's not about not demonizing either the kind of either or, is it? It's about, as you said before, it's not either or, it's and it's blending the two.
The irony, if you make it more positive on one side than the other, it's more likely to be less productive, because if you have your friends, let's just say, okay, growth mindset is fantastic. You know what all those growth mindset extroverts will do, because extroversion is also correlated with narcissism? Is Isn't it brilliant? I knew I was right. Joanna, you just have a fixed mindset. When you ask me all those nitpicky questions about budgeting for next year, you just need to have growth mindset. Or now some people talk about infinite mindset. Like, that's not freaking dangerous. Infinite mindset on a finite planet? Yeah, instead of recycling, we're focusing on mining asteroids. Whoop, whoop. Anyways, and circular economy. And that's great. But instead of actually looking back and thinking, okay, if I value this, how can I value the other more? How can I go to my people with fixed mindsets and say, what do you need more from me to play to your strengths? Instead of putting growth mindset on a big flag and starting to wave it around everywhere. And I think that if we don't come in with to me, whenever I use any psychology model in practice, it has to have the depends. Because the classical psychologist joke, what's a psychologist answer to every question? It depends. And the longer you're in the profession, you realize it's true because it depends on a lot of variables. So you cannot make a decision. You cannot say something is good, something is bad. So whichever model I use within the corporate, it's usually bimodal, and it usually says both sides are good, and both sides can be overplayed, and it depends when. So never use a test of assessment of something that's called a bright side or a dark side of personality. Like, what's emotional intelligence, what's not, what's working for you, what's not. We cannot tell that from a typical psychometric what's working and what's not. So I would never come into a company using a model which says one is good, one is bad, because then I might be inadvertently increasing stereotypes and biases within the company, which might not do that organization any favors.
You argue really strongly in the book about the importance of diversity. Managers will often recruit in their own like, even when you put checks and balances in place. When they're interviewing, they'll often say, there's just something about that candidate that just is really appealing about them. And often it's because they're like them. How do you start to integrate diversity into an organization, and whose responsibility is it? If you start to invite people in that have got a different approach, different sort of personality traits or whatever, we often have a response. How can we start to create that diversity in our organizations?
Well, first, I would suggest that the diversity might be already there. It's just culture doesn't allow it to come out. So maybe first we need to address through culture. So you can even look at your personality profiles that you have done before and do a little bit of data mining. So you can say to the companies that use the psychometrics, can we do some data mining? We gave you all that money for the profiles. Can we just understand, is there particular traits which are more prevalent in particular departments or across the company? And then you'll find that, we get lots of extroverts. Then you can look at get a pool of people who just went through your selection process and ask them, how was it? And also get their personality. So, oh my God, we recruited a lot of extroverts. Then you can go, but I found the job description to be really appealing. It said, fun environment, lots of fun, lots of have high pace, and you must have a good sense of humor. And then you can go, okay, where did we advertise this? Oh, we advertised it in a website has to do with vacancies in sport. I don't know. But it's actually who gets to see those job descriptions. Are those job descriptions attracting particular kinds of personalities or demographics as well? And, how is the selection process structured? Does it require a person to come into central London for a day of activities and fun, and then we'll all go out drinking, and that's where the real selection begins? So people who wanted a quiet night immediately get selected out. So it's just, the thing is that it's very important that that was hyperbole, by the way. I'm not saying companies actually select based on that, but on drinking in pubs. I don't know, maybe some people do.
I don't know. We do some work in the city, so
Yeah.
I think that's still okay there, actually.
It could be, but yeah, it's just really important here is that you look through the whole selection process, starting with where the job is advertised, job description, selection process, and also then you also look at particular culture. Let's say if you have short-term bonuses, which are based on your individual performance. Don't expect a lot of empathy and vulnerability in that environment, or if you're very in a very heavy regulated environment, there's only so much creativity you can have. After all, creative accountancy has a very different connotations with that word, creativity. So it's looking at through kind of more systemic. I guess that's a cool word, systemic, to use for this case.
Yeah.
But first, look at the culture. Ask people, do an anonymous survey, what aspects of your personality you consciously manage at work, for example. See if there's any common themes. Maybe some of the assessments you already use in your company can give you an indication of that. Choose carefully, take your time, and always haggle. So choose carefully. There's different models out there. And the issue is that most providers only sell you one. So the consultant you're talking to will just sell you one assessment because that's what they're trained for. That's what they can get commission for. So it's very hard to get like actual opinion about this assessment. So you need to gather it yourself. So one way to do it, talk with an occupational psychologist specialized in psychometrics who doesn't have affiliation with any particular publisher. Say, what are the assessments? Also try to find in your network people who already use that assessment and ask them how they find it. Not only how they find use assessment, but also what support they get from the publisher, what can be, how proactive the publisher is in supporting them, and do they get value for money? And just ask them what are the problems with the publisher as well. If you're going to be using assessments for selection, always look for the name of that assessment and the word tribunal in Google. Because a lot of tribunals are public right now. There was even a report on Sky News about one, which that publisher doesn't use anymore. So it's not that applicable, but it's a good learning experience. Also, you can approach the British Psychological Societies. They do reviews of assessments, so you can source them for 30 quid. You can get like a review of a particular assessment just from an independent body. So you can do also that. But mainly, I would say ask around your network. Talk with the publisher as well, what support they can provide, what the limitations of the tool, etc. Talk about things like neurodiversity and assessment, how it might be impacted. Talk about, best practice, what they can do to ensure you good service, and yada, yada, yada. And then so if you're going to be using it for development of your senior leadership group, after you've selected maybe 1 or 2 assessments, ask the publishers to support you with giving a pilot within the company. So get the senior leadership group, let's say in this case, to complete 1, 2, 3 assessments, and then ask them what they thought about it. Of course, also complete it yourself and ask somebody to debrief you. I forgot that step. And when you complete it, always look at the items which you're completing, because this is what your clients will see as well. And make a note like, okay, this item which I'm asked, this question doesn't make sense to me. Make a note of it. So next time you talk to the publisher, you say, sorry, what does this item exactly measure? Because if it didn't make sense to you, it might not make sense to your clients. There's some weird, freaky items out there, let me tell you. And then have a debrief with a consultant. If you enjoyed this tool, make a list of 3, 2, send it to your demographic, get them to complete, get their feedback, what works best, what they found most useful. And only after this, sign up with one particular tool. But at that point, haggle for the price. If you're a corporate, if you think you already can roll it out, okay, we're going to buy 500 portraits or reports. What is the best price you can give us to qualify 5 of us?
I'll find a viewer question. Danny, this is Sarah again, who asked another great question, wasn't it?
So Sarah had one more question, which was, how can understanding personality inform our leadership development programs and coaching?
Well, it's back to the subjectivity, because with personality, you realize that if you're doing leadership development with personality psychology, is that everybody is different. So everybody sees leadership differently. So one of my favorite things to do when you do a leadership workshop is, if you can use the word leadership, what word would you use? And most people will have different ones. Some people will use mentoring, some people use, drive, some people say motivation, all that jazz, because everybody has a different idea what leadership is.
And there's no academic definition of leadership, is there? Researchers don't agree on it. So
good. But the key thing is that it's subjective. It's leadership, going back to that word stress. People think are so wonderfully objective. So what's stress for me is what's stress to you. What leadership for me is what's leadership to you. And best of all, what leadership is for me is the same to the people I lead. That's where it gets interesting. Because, I think what's also really important is that a lot of leadership development is using frameworks without asking the delegates what's it useful for. So how often, companies spend hundreds of thousands on the leadership program, but when the leaders turn up to the program, they go, what the hell is this? What is this? Why am I here? And when you go to HR says, no, but we told their managers to tell them about this exciting program that they're on and how special it is. Like, their managers have the freaking time, honestly, really. Like, you ask their managers to tell them how awesome the program is, instead of actually working on a psychological contract, let's say, with each individual on the leadership development program. So I would always, when running a leadership development program, I always have one-to-ones first to walk them through their psychometric profiles of 360, what have you. But what's really important here is that you ask them to then talk to their manager or a couple of their colleagues, or look at their performance reviews over the last couple of years and highlight ones in positives in one color, development areas in other. They can triangulate between the feedback they get from others and their performance review, and say, and the only question I want you to ask is, you're on this leadership development program for 3 months. If there's one quality as a leader you'd most benefit from developing, what would it be? So you can ask your colleagues, you can ask your manager if you're in a good relationship with them. It's important you have your own motivation. And the personality assessment can help you triangulate. Like, going back, then you mentioned high extrovert leaders, well, count to 15, or speak last, just for the giggle. Let's see what the dynamic of the meeting changes. Just go wild. Or if you want to really push the boat out after somebody finished talking, can you listen to them? Wow, say if there's anything else they'd like to add. But that's kind of a big push there. If you already listened to them for like 10 minutes. But the key thing is just so you have your own motivation, what you want to take away from the leadership development program. And then I think the key thing is facilitating collective intelligence. I have seen so many presentations, which is death by models and PowerPoint. It's incredible. Some people try to jam in 10 separate psychology models into one presentation. Jesus Christ, I didn't have this at any lectures in psychology I studied at master's level. I never went to a lecture on psychology like, kids, we'll do 10 models today. We might have done one. And this busy executives are bombarded with 10 models about vulnerability, growth mindset. Here's a picture of an elephant and a man on top. This is how consciousness works. Next. Jesus Christ. I'm obsessed by the field, but even that's too much for me. Just keep it simple. Keep it practical. Every time the group is looking on the PowerPoints, they're not looking at each other. I have stopped using PowerPoint a long time ago. If I'm using one model at a time, and then people learning from each other. I don't know how to make openness work in your organizations, but Danny here off the scale, and they're a managing director. Danny, how did you manage? In this high, Bob there says it's the most regulated environment he ever works for. There's no creativity, but look, Danny, you're managing this. What's your secret? Oh, I don't take credit for anybody's for my ideas. Oh, great. So how does that work? And stuff like that. So we don't know. And I think this is what's really exciting, because if you work within a company, let's say you have a team build of people who've been in careers for 20 years in engineering, have no idea how it is to be an engineer. Zilch. But what's really exciting, I have a room of 10 people with 20 years experience each, roughly speaking. So I have 200 years of experience. Those people are in their 30s and 40s. So I have in this room 300 to 400 years of different self-narratives put together. Now, isn't it exciting I get to work with them for a day? Isn't it exciting we get to explore this together and the different misconceptions and biases we have about all things around us? Isn't it fun we get to challenge this in a friendly and live manner with appreciation of my favorite quote from the end of Some Like It Hot, Nobody's Perfect? Isn't it interesting to explore this, how you can make it as an extrovert and as an engineer, or equally as an introvert? Can't we learn from each other? Can't we see how we can work together better? And most importantly, appreciate. My favorite exercise right now is that I get, and this can be done online or in person, and in a team of 10, we'll focus on each person at a time, and we'll say, where do you feel most comfortable? Like extroversion, outcome, big picture, affiliation, doesn't matter, terminology. Where you feel most comfortable. And then everybody says what they appreciate this person brings to the team. Or they type it into Slido or Mentimeter and it pops up as a nice word cloud. And then you ask each person to unmute or share why they wrote it down in as much detail as possible with real world examples. And then you ask that person to play back what they hear. And then they nominate the next person. Whether it comes to personality or teamwork, the key thing is we don't appreciate who we are already. Humans are wonderfully complex. We're highly adaptable creatures, which can work in teams to freaking achieve amazing stuff like putting a person on the moon. It's so amazing or build the pyramids. It's so amazing that the future generation can't believe we did it, and they think it was aliens, because we can't actually even come to terms that we can come together as a species and do amazing stuff together. And same as, with climate change. Yeah, sure, we caused some of it. Sure, probably. Yeah. But isn't it amazing that we can also come together to address this issue, to actually solve this by working together? If people say, well, there's not enough meaning in the world, address climate change. Let's stop polluting so much. Let's address empty consumerism. There's so much meaning there that we can derive from coming together and working together as a species on this. And it's amazing what we can do. And same as it's amazing what we do as individuals, as teams, as organizations, good and bad. But the key thing is, and with personality, it got you this far. When people say, well, my mother and dad messed me up. Yeah, likely. But that therapy for that. But the key thing is, they at least function well enough to give you a chance at this life and get you this far. And the parents before them and parents before them. And you get the idea. And I feel that so much time with leadership development, personality development, all of this, quoting Kurt Vonnegut, when things are going nice, just sit back and say, if this is not nice, I don't know what is. And I think so much with teams and our own personality, we just don't take it. It's like, this is me. It got me this far. If there's some things I want to tweak, yeah, maybe. Can I work more effectively with others first who already have that? Probably. How can I work with them? And this is one of my favorite quotes by Allport, that guy who started with Oddbird, who started the statistical analysis and factor analysis, which led to the Big Five. He says, if I want to know something about somebody, I ask them. So we can go, how can we work together better? How would you like feedback? Instead of going to Harvard Business Review and say, top 10 tips how to give somebody feedback, just go and sit down with them. John, how would you like to, John, just curious, how do you like your feedback?
There's so much good stuff in there, and you quoted Kurt Vonnegut. There was a really nice quote there that you put in the book as well. We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful who we pretend to be as well.
Exactly. So when people behave in different ways in organizations, ultimately that's how other people interpret you. So if you're highly introverted and you pretend to be much more extroverted at work because you're tired of people telling you that, oh, you didn't like my presentation, what are you worried about because you're so poker faced? You start being really extrovert and a bit more exuberant, and then you call it, and you're exhausted by the end of the day, but your colleagues go, oh, let's go to the pub. And you go, how dare you? I'm so stressed by interacting with you all day. And they go, how dare they ask me? And they think you might be extroverted and you might actually enjoy going to the pub. So, and this is where it's going back to that point. If you feel some people describe you in a way you disagree with them, don't go, that's not me. Ask them, why do they think you're this way? And that's far more interesting to explore. Because to me, personality, going back to the point, we've been talking about it for thousands of years. And we still talk about it. Maybe how often do we use personality in everyday language? How often people around us use it? We still use it because it's interesting and it's useful. And personality psychology is just one kind of manifestation of this right now. And from our book, and its finishes was to be continued, in no way we say it's a finished article. We wrote it a year ago. Stuff has already changed. We already made editions coming up for the reprint, which is hopefully coming as well. But there's already stuff we disagree with what we wrote a year ago, because it has already changed. It has already moved on. And this is what's really kind of interesting. And talking, and one last note, just to say why the book was written. I wrote it with a wonderful guy, Georgi, and the reason I met him is that we disagreed on LinkedIn. And I have a policy, anybody who I disagree with on social media, especially work-related matters, I have a call with. Because so often when you disagree, you just talk to people who agree with you and go, you're right, they're wrong.
If people would like to reach out to you and, talk to you about your book, or how can people get hold of you?
Well, first, if you want to reach out the book, it's available on Waterstones and Amazon. And now also Blackwell's for the students out there. You can pre-order it there. Well, now you can order it, update. For me, always happy to connect on LinkedIn and have a chat about personality. A bit obsessed by this stuff, to be honest, if it's not clear by now. But yeah, thank you for the opportunity to rattle on about personality for an hour.
Well, we have so many questions we didn't actually get to as well.
Oh,
So
really?
so when you do a sequel, we want to invite. If would you mind if we invite you back again? There's lots of interesting things that I'm taking away from this, and what's been really nice is just keep it simple. The importance of appreciating who you are rather than trying to focus on what's not working. We're often drawn to the world of deficit, aren't we? I really liked what you said about the balance of yin and yang and the importance of actually appreciating that diversity from all perspectives. There was a quote in there that I really liked, which is, the diversity is already there, it's just culture doesn't allow it. And I think that's a really powerful quote, which I really enjoyed. And also just being mindful of just how there's different things in your organization which will potentially be encouraging different types of behaviors or discouraging it. So you said short-term targets, don't expect empathy. So just be aware of how the building blocks of the organizations. And if you are evaluating at all, just type in the words tribunal and assessment. So that's for our HR audience. I think they'll appreciate that. And I guess sort of the other thing as well is just having an appreciation that people perceive you in a different way. So be open and be curious about how people are experiencing you. It will be surprising, and be open to actually asking those questions too, rather than sort of defending who we are. Actually take the time to understand.
Yeah, because other people have the rights to their vision of reality. And if that's how they perceive you, that's how they perceive you. It's not saying that you are that. It's how they see you. And same as how you see them. One of my favorite things to ask clients is that how would you describe yourself? Ask them, what do people get wrong about your personality?
Mm,
And especially with remote teams, when they
yes.
come together as a team, that's potentially potent because, now we don't have time for water cooler chats or coffee chats or anything like that. So, and when you finish your team meetings 15 minutes early, it's like, I'll let you have 15 minutes of your life, like go to the bathroom or have a tea, or both. 15 minutes is enough time, right? But the key thing is that what's really important here is that we don't have a lot of input about other people's characters, and our mind doesn't mind that. And it's amazing how our assumptions work and how little information we can make decision about this. And Garen, you said that about hiring managers. Oh, I just like that. And this is when people say, oh, we're fully inclusive. We don't use personality assessments as part of hiring. We don't use any assessments at all. But just because you're not using assessments, your selection panel is still assessing, because they will be using, oh, I don't like the way they cross their legs. It shows they're uncomfortable, or cross their arms, or they scratch their head, or they put their arms behind their head. And I read this is when the people feel superior. He sounds like an ass. And it's like, what? Just put their arms behind their head. It's amazing. And it's also really fun if you get people with similar personalities on the panel selecting a candidate. And if you get different personalities on the panel selecting a candidate. And it can be the same interview, but the result is completely different. It's things like that, which can be really interesting.
Fascinating. Wow. Well, I hope for people that are watching this today, it's kind of opened their eyes to just the possibilities and things to explore. And there's so much more material in the book for you to read and to enjoy as well. And don't even get me started on where people live and what their personalities are reflected like as well. That's another thing.
Georgi wrote that. So for the next one, if you want to dive deeper into this, I'll get my co-author on it, because I had almost no idea beyond what I read in the book. And I was like, interesting.
Well, as an extrovert, I'm off to the beach now to go and live. So that's according to the stats.
That climate change, I'd rent rather than buy.
Or the sea might come to me, actually, I think. I'll stay where I am.
Exactly.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nikita. Really appreciative of your time, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karen and Danny.
Yeah, thank you very much.